Takei of Suru for Solidarity in order to help begin thinking about the connections between this history and the work that Suru is doing and aims to do. Before we lead into what should be a really generative Q&A with you and everyone in the room today, and a few invitations to reflect and interact at the end of the evening. During the presentations, if you could make sure that you stay muted so we don't have kind of ambient noise going on, that would be excellent. But please do feel free, again, if you feel comfortable, to offer questions in the chat as they arise, or comments and reactions that you have as we listen together. If you need any technical assistance or something is not working well, please feel free to get in touch with Mika Chan in the chat, who will be our technical assistance for today. And if you'd like to watch this presentation with closed captioning, you can go to the bottom of your Zoom window and tap on the toolbar at the bottom in order to be able to see the closed captioning. And if you need help with that, again, please feel free to be in touch with Mika Chan for all of your technical needs. All right, on behalf of the Suru for Solidarity Education and Policy Advocacy Committees, I'm going to go ahead and turn this to one of my co-chairs, Catherine Hirata, to introduce our speakers.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So I'm Catherine. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Policy Advocacy Committee. And I just wanted to provide a brief introduction. So starting with Professor Paik. So Naomi Paik is the author of Bans, Walls, Raids, Sanctuary, Understanding U.S. Immigration for the 21st Century, as well as Rightlessness, Testimony and Redress in U.S. Prison Camps Since World War II, as well as many articles, opinion pieces, and interviews in a range of academic and public-facing venues. She is co-chair of the Radical History Review editorial collective and has co-edited 3 special issues of the journal, Militarism and Capitalism, Radical Histories of Sanctuary, and Policing, Justice, and the Radical Imagination. And she will co-edit Against the Anthropocene with Ashley Dawson. Collaborating with Gerry, Cadava, and Kat Ramirez, she co-edits the Borderlands section of Public Books. She is an associate professor of Criminology, Law and Justice, and Global Asian Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and a member of the Migration Scholars Collaborative. She earned her doctorate in American Studies from Yale University. And then moving on to Suru's own Carl Takei, who will be in conversation with her later in the evening. So Carl Takei is a Yonsei descendant of prisoners held at Tule Lake and Amachi, as well as the DOJ camp in Bismarck. He lives in New York City and is a senior staff attorney at the National ACLU, where he coordinates police practices litigation and related advocacy work. Previously, Carl conducted litigation and advocacy at the ACLU on prison privatization, immigration detention, and related issues. He is lead author of the 2016 ACLU report, Shutting Down the Profiteers, Why and How the Department of Homeland Security Should Stop Using Private Prisons, as well as the 2014 ACLU report, Warehoused and Forgotten, Immigrants Trapped in Our Shadow Private Prison System, and a co-author of the 2016 ACLU NIJC DWN report, Fatal Neglect, How ICE Ignores Deaths in Detention. Carl has testified before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, before a working group of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and briefed members of Congress regarding private prisons and immigrant detention. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Paik.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here and spending your Thursday evening on yet another Zoom call. I want to thank Catherine Hirata, Suru for Solidarity, and the co-panelists Carl Takei and Mika Kennedy for inviting me to take part in this crucial conversation on the history of migrant detention. And I really am honored to be speaking to Suru for Solidarity. I met Satsuki Ina, I think, when was it? It was before the plague. So sometime before what is time anymore? I think it was 2 years ago. But she gave a really beautiful and moving talk. And then we talked about the work that you guys did with Bob Leibel and grassroots leadership. And so I've been following your work for a while, and I really am truly honored to be here. So I'm going to share my screen and then get going. All right. So as you heard from my really lovely introduction, thank you so much for that. My research and teaching has long focused on different forms of US state violence, particularly focusing on imprisonment and immigration regimes, sometimes together and how they overlap, and sometimes independently of each other. And so in particular, I've examined criminal legal systems and mass incarceration, immigrant and migrant detentions, the Japanese American World War II incarceration, the history of Haitian migration and their criminalization by the US state, and also war on terror camps in places like Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. So I'm interested in how these different forms of detention are linked together, but without basically saying that they're all the same, like without flattening out their differences. And so before I get into more detail about the enduring and more recent history of immigrant and migrant detentions, I want to kind of go all the way back. I'm a historian, so I kind of do this a lot, but I want to go back to two key foundational moments for both imprisonment and anti-immigrant regimes. This is really great. This is the Muslim protest at Chicago, at the O'Hare Airport. But the first key foundational moment that I want to point us to is settler colonialism. So settler colonialism, the US has built on settler colonial foundations. And this is just a jargony way of saying that the United States is built fundamentally from the beginning on the theft of indigenous lands and the continued efforts to eradicate indigenous peoples and replace them with a new, permanent, and settler society. And in this country, that settler society is fundamentally rooted in whiteness. And we can see this both in the OG document, the Constitution, as well as the 1790 Naturalization Act that restricted citizenship solely to free white persons. So it has always been a white racial project, right? And as Kelly Lotto Hernandez argues, settler colonial societies strive to exclude others by deporting, hiding, or criminalizing them, or otherwise revoking the right of racialized outsiders to be within the invaded territory. Okay, so what is she saying here? She's basically saying that settler colonialism is central not only to the attempted annihilation of indigenous peoples, but also to the exclusion, containment, and removal of other racial others who do not fit into the idealized settler society. So anyone who is cast as not white, right? Since the very core foundation of this country is based in white nationalism, anyone who doesn't fit that racial identity is subject to exclusion and deportation or other forms of confinement. Right? So settlers do this. They expel, exclude other racial others, even while relying on them for their exploitable labor to build and sustain this the new nation, right? And so this is how we can have settler colonialism alongside a history of kidnapping and enslaving African descended people, right? Whom the US, the way our strategy for containing them was to just deny them humanity altogether, let alone citizenship and civic participation. And this settler colonial foundation also helps us understand how the US both depends on racialized immigrant labor while working to exclude immigrants from through deportations and criminalization. And so we can see this move to both exploit immigrant labor and yet exclude them and contain them in the 19th century origins of immigration restriction, which is rooted from the jump in racism, patriarchy, and capitalist labor exploitation. So our first federal immigration laws were the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which targeted Chinese women and workers, weaving together gender, race, and class into this original ban. And so this anti-Chinese law would ultimately spread to cover all of Asia, right? And Chinese exclusion, it's Chinese exclusion that compelled the state to build its immigration bureaucracy, right? Including the use of documents, border inspectors, and deportation and detention infrastructures. But Chinese people didn't just be like, okay, I guess I'm excluded now. No, they didn't relinquish themselves to these racist laws. They organized. They refused to comply with demands to obtain immigration documents, authorizing their presence in the US, and they organized themselves a legal defense fund to contest these laws in federal courts. And so in each of these cases, however, the Supreme Court sided with the government against immigrants and immigrant rights. It ultimately decided that Congress and the president have so-called plenary power, or absolute unqualified power over immigration issues. And so essentially the court was saying that the judiciary exercises no checks or balances over the other branches of government when it comes to immigration. And the way it justified this decision is that it claims that it is the US state's right to determine who gets to be here or who doesn't, right? Essentially, the courts since the 19th century all the way up to the present have been saying that basically the same thing as Trump, right? They say it more tastefully, but the logic of their argument is the same thing, right? If the state can't control its borders and exclude and expel people it doesn't want here, then we don't have a country anymore. Okay, so it's not about Trump, it's about the United States. Okay. So the courts have decided basically over and over that the US right to exclude, deport, and detain non-citizens overrides any non-citizens' constitutional rights. So non-citizens in detention basically have very few due process protections, right? In this case, Wong Wing in particular, this is where I'm getting more into the history of detention. Right? This is crucial when it comes to thinking about immigrant detention. And the precedents we set during Chinese exclusion still stand today. In Wong Wing, the Supreme Court determined that being undocumented is not a crime, and that continues to be the case today. Instead, it is a civil offense, right? But the fact that it's not a crime and only a civil offense also means that immigrants in detention are not being punished for a crime, right? And they thus do not have the nominal due process rights of criminal defendants, like the right to a lawyer or a speedy hearing. So instead, immigrant detention is considered not imprisonment in a legal sense, okay? Legally, immigrant detention is not considered punishment at all, right? Neither is deportation. It is merely an administrative measure. You're in one place and you're supposed to be in another place. That's all it's considered. It doesn't matter what the experience of the immigrant under detention is. All that matters is how we categorize it, right? So it's almost like the perspective of the person being subjected to these practices is immaterial, and that continues to be the case today. So, this is a clip from a documentary on PBS called Lost in Detention, and you can watch the whole thing. It's about an hour, but I'm going to just show you this quick clip.
We take away the basic right to liberty and the right to due process. When the government takes away your basic right to liberty, it should be equivalent to that in the criminal context. That's unfortunately not the case. Immigration matters are not criminal matters. Those are administrative matters. There's no punishment that the Immigration Service metes out. It is simply a question of whether you're supposed to be here or whether you're supposed to be there. That's an administrative matter. And the Supreme Court has said repeatedly for over a century that due process in immigration matters is whatever Congress says it is. Without that, no.
Oops, okay. So, yes. Okay, so that second guy who was talking, this guy, Mark Krikorian. Okay, he is talking from a right-wing organization that the Southern Poverty Law Center has designated as a hate group because of its anti-immigrant policy or advocacy. But he actually has a correct understanding of legal history. What he is saying is absolutely correct, unfortunately. So it's not about like not liking this right-wing person. It's about not like undoing all the groundwork that he's talking about, right? And so ever since these original immigration bans of Chinese exclusion, the US has expanded its social control over all kinds of non-citizens, targeting wider and wider swaths of people it considers undesirable. So for example, just months after passing the Chinese Exclusion Act, Congress then moved to restrict the entry of any, quote, convict, lunatic, idiot, or any person likely to become a public charge. And so we can see the kind of intersectional roots. It's very ableist, it's anti-poverty, etc. It's against single women, all these different kinds of things. So we can see the intersectional roots of our immigration policy, but it's only from the dark side. Who can we exclude, right? Who do we find undesirable? Oh, oops, sorry. Okay. In 1924, the same year that it passed the Johnson-Reed Act, which was the first globally restrictive immigration law and the legislative achievement of the eugenics movement, because it was designed to ensure a white nation, Congress also created the Border Patrol, right? A few years later, in 1929, it first criminalized entering the country without authorization, basically bypassing border control checkpoints, just, walking across the border. Right. And this criminalization of crossing the border without permission led to one of the first immigrant prison booms in our history, fueled by the sweeping away of Mexican migrant laborers. And as today, the federal government had to build more detention centers just to deal with this explosive growth that was the anticipated consequence of that criminalizing law. Right. And it's this criminalization of unauthorized entry that lies at the root of the catastrophes we've been seeing at the southern border for years. So this criminalization of migrants and other vulnerable and targeted people have sped up dramatically over the last 40 or so years, or what jargon heads call the era of Neo-Liberalism. And so this era over the past 40, 50 years is marked by widening wealth and inequality, basically this, the hoovering of wealth by the 1%, the abandonment of the welfare state, and the increasing reliance on policing and prisons to maintain social control over people the increasing numbers of people who are being left further and further behind. And so this is the period of the war on drugs, racist mass incarceration, the explosive growth and militarization of policing, and the evisceration of the Bill of Rights, except for the Second Amendment. So in terms of immigration, a central but yet often overlooked or elided case in the development of migrant detention is the targeting of Black Caribbean migrants, particularly Haitians, who have been, they are basically canaries in the coal mine for anti-immigrant practices that have spread to impact all kinds of non-citizens. And I'm leaning in on this point a little bit to highlight the centrality of anti-Black racism that undergirds our criminalization of migrants and immigrants. So in the late 1970s and early 1980s, we implemented the so-called Haitian program, which was designed with the intention of excluding, detaining, and deporting Haitian migrants. It was the first kind of nationally based exclusion, or well, in the modern era, it had this specific nation in mind for exclusion. And several of its core techniques have now become normalized and spread throughout the anti-immigrant regime. So I'm just going to go through these kind of quickly. So first, with interdiction, what interdiction means is that the US patrols international waters, basically all of these waters that separates Miami from Hispaniola, right? So it patrols international waters, intercepts small boats carrying migrants, and returns those migrants back to Haiti with, at most, a cursory asylum review. So this practice essentially extends the border hundreds of miles into international waters beyond US territory in violation of international law. And this practice now spreads beyond to other spaces as well. So now we pay Mexico to police its Guatemalan border in order to prevent migrants from reaching the US at all. And as we know, Haitian migrants are once again at the forefront of anti-immigrant targeting, with Title 42 and our zero tolerance border control policies leading to the mass deportations of thousands of Haitians who traveled through Mexico to our southern border. So they like our interdiction practices targeted them first to the ocean, and now they are subject to the same practice at our land border. For those migrants who actually make it to the US, the US circumvented the courts by delaying compliance with court orders that would restrict government practices, and it would issue blanket denials of due process through strategies like mass hearings or scheduling multiple hearings in different courts with the same lawyers and things like that. And these kinds of practices, as you can see from this image, are also becoming increasingly normalized with the mass criminalization of unauthorized border crossings and other punitive practices. And the US targeting of Haitian migrants also led to a resurgent importance of detention to the anti-immigrant regime, with more immigrant prisons like the notorious Chrome Detention Center in Southern Florida, which was built on a former Nike missile site, quickly built to cage them. And we've also seen how our targeting of Haitians has led to the use of offshore detention, transporting migrants to locations well beyond US territory, like colonial sites in Puerto Rico, and of course, the military base at Guantanamo Bay. And in fact, just as Japanese survivors had just received their redress payments, right, and formal letters of apology from the George H.W. Bush administration, that same administration opened up this massive migrant camp at Guantanamo that detained tens of thousands of Haitians before sending most back to certain persecution. It also set the precedent for indefinite detention, both for migrants and for enemy combatants, through an HIV prison camp that detained almost 300 there without any clear end in sight. And indeed, we keep Guantanamo on standby for potential migration crises in the Caribbean. So we're ready to deploy camp imprisonment to detain and deport migrants. And again, we shouldn't forget that Guantanamo as an enemy combatant camp is still open and still indefinitely detaining and torturing 39 people there. And this migrant detention camp for Haitians set the direct historical, infrastructural, and legal precedent for these enemy combatant camps. John Yoo, one of the architects of this, of the torture memos, drew directly on this history of the Haitian refugee camp to assert that this site was a legal black hole where neither the courts nor international law held any sway. So at the War on Terror camps and in US prisons, we see the menacing convergence of the national security state fusing with immigration control and anti-Muslim racism, especially since 9/11. So the sweeping powers that the George W. Bush administration seized for the executive branch in the wake of 9/11 have led to the expansion of authoritarian, anti-democratic powers. And non-citizens have always been their first targets. So while some of these strategies innovated under the War on Terror were initially designed to target Arab and Muslim people, they are in fact spreading to affect all kinds of people who can now be cast as terrorists, whether they are indigenous land and water protectors for their attacks on infrastructure, Black Lives Matter organizers as Black radicals, or Muslim community leaders. All of these different categories of people have been labeled as terrorists and then subject to certain kinds of federal surveillance and policing regimes. Okay, so this audience already knows the history of the World War incarceration of ethnic Japanese people from the US West Coast, its illegitimate justification in national security, its actual basis in white supremacy and economic competition, and the devastating effects it had on Japanese American people and communities. And as we know, this incarceration not only targeted Japanese immigrants who were barred from naturalizing and getting citizenship, but it also alienated US-born Japanese American citizens from their citizenship in order to strip them of their constitutional rights. And something similar is happening today. So authoritarian state violence is being developed and deployed right in front of us against those we consider not part of us, right? But these tactics spread beyond migrants to crush democratic freedoms for all of us, including citizens. And so, for example, we can see this in the use of CBP, or Customs and Border Protection drones, being used to terrorize and surveil Black Lives Matter protesters collectively mourning George Floyd's death in Minneapolis in the summer of 2020. Furthermore, the legacy of internment still lingers today. It's example raised to justify racial profiling, like a Muslim registry. This was, circulating a lot during the 2016 presidential campaign. Right? And so the Korematsu case, for example, justifying the racist evacuation and ultimately internment, was still considered fully constitutional and laid like a loaded weapon as official judicial precedent all the way to 2018. But ironically, the Supreme Court finally overturned that infamous decision in the same case that it affirmed the Muslim ban as fully constitutional. So in this case, Trump v. Hawaii, the Supreme Court at once ruled that the Muslim ban fully aligned with the Constitution, violating neither the Equal Protection Clause nor the ban on religious discrimination, while simultaneously overturning the Korematsu decision that similarly decided race-based mass incarceration was fully constitutional. Right? So in repudiating one racist decision, the court enshrined another. So the Supreme Court sanction authorization of the Muslim ban gives this loaded weapon not only to the presidency that tried to pass it, right, but also to any administration that follows for the foreseeable future. How long is this precedent going to last? So this history shows us that we really need to think very carefully about the strategies of US state violence, how they get innovated and worked out against particular targeted groups, whether enemy aliens, deceased refugees, migrant hordes, enemy combatants, super predators, gang members, or other categories that are not yet fully developed. But once those categories and targets and strategies are created, they're very mobile. So those policies, laws, infrastructures, and rhetorical strategies remain available to be deployed against all kinds of people. So as we've seen, these same logics and infrastructures are used to criminalize and detain these babies and children who we often see as being completely innocent, because they are, right? And when we see images like these, we are rightfully outraged and devastated by them. But my point is that we need to be outraged well before we get to the point that we're tearing babies from their parents' arms, right? We need to be outraged when ad hoc policies innovated in emergency situations are deployed against certain kinds of migrants. We need to be outraged before they harden into legislation passed by Congress and signed by the president, before the budget lines are allocated to ICE, CBP, and regular cops to enforce those laws, and before the contracts with prison corporations like the GEO Group are signed and detention centers or camps are built. And this also means that we need to defend the targeted people even when they aren't babies and children, and even if they do not fit our conception of who is most innocent or deserving or valuable to us. So I don't really have time to go into this right now, but I am proposing an abolitionist approach to sanctuary as one strategy for doing this kind of work. So this abolitionist sanctuary would combine sanctuary's radical welcome to anyone without condition, even people we don't like, even when they're not completely innocent or have done something legitimately wrong, and abolition's organizing to dismantle life-annihilating institutions like cops, ICE, CBP, and prisons, and instead building up life-affirming institutions like healthcare, education, full employment, and nourishing food. So both of these things, sanctuary and abolition, require defending people right now while building the world we want in its place. where bans, walls, raids, and detentions are no longer thinkable because the conditions that feed them no longer exist. And above all, it means taking care of each other and building robust relationships of mutual accountability and reciprocity with each other and with those we don't yet know. And I think in using the lived experience and legacy of racist incarceration, Suru for Solidarity is already doing some of this work, demanding an end to migrant incarcerations and working to free them all. And I hope that those on this call can continue this work and continue pushing ourselves to make that all and free them all as expansive and not exclusive as possible. Okay, thanks so much. Okay.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Paik. Now I'm gonna turn it over to you and Carl.
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, so it's really great to see that, you know, the roots of our current policies in, you know, the sort of 19th and early 20th century white supremacy. And I want to acknowledge that, you know, we're doing this against the backdrop of two trials right now of, you know, the Rittenhouse trial and the McMichael Bryan trial of the killers of Ahmaud Arbery, where you know, like it's sort of this white supremacist vigilantism that is at play. Can you talk about how much of that sort of white supremacist imprint of those laws has been deployed by both Democratic and Republican administrations more recently?
No, that's a great question. It's really horrifying to see what's happening in both of these trials. I can barely like tolerate keeping up with them, just like seeing what the judge in the Rittenhouse trial and like, you know, the all-white jury and Ahmaud Arbery's murderers trial, et cetera. But getting to your question about white supremacist laws being boosted by both, it is a bipartisan issue, basically criminalizing and villainizing immigrants it works for both sides of the aisle. And one of the people that I have endless capacity and resources to criticize and to take down are the Clintons, because they are so central to so many of the especially in the contemporary period, they are so central to so many of the problems that we have with mass incarceration and with immigrant detention, deportations, right? So they are, Bill Clinton, under his administration, he passed the EDPA, which was an anti-terrorism act justified by the Oklahoma City bombing, which was performed by two white nationalists, right? But it mobilized a law that ended up targeting mostly Arab and Muslim people, right? And it also had these sweeping kind of expansions of powers of surveillance and state violence against certain kinds of targeted people. In the same year, in 1996, we also passed the ERA, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, right? And this is, if we really want to move forward and really dismantle the anti-immigrant systems that we are facing today, we have to battle against ERA, because a lot of the policies that we see today that are being deployed in terms of cops collaborating with ICE and CBP, et cetera, all this information and data sharing, the deputization of regular cops and sheriffs, things like this, all of that can be traced to ERA, right? The other thing is that Bill Clinton also had anti-immigrant provisions in his devastatingly horrible welfare reform bill, welfare deform bill. So it's a welfare, basically he sought to, and he did end welfare as we know it, right? Changing it from welfare to workfare, but he also had tons of anti-immigrant provisions in there. So immigrants could no longer like get WIC for their children or food stamps for their citizen children, right? And so all of these things work together. He was also a huge booster of crime bills, you know, which led to explosive growth in mass incarceration. Like, he has never been our friend. And so for him to I mean, I know it's Toni Morrison, but she makes mistakes too. But like to call him like our first Black president, or to say that he is a friend to Black people, is just historically objectively wrong, right? And so you cannot look at the actual policies that people like him and our current president, who was a big booster and signatory of the 94 crime bill, you cannot look at the actual policies that they passed and say that they are not supporting white supremacy. It is not actually possible. When you look at the devastating racist impacts of those policies and laws, and you trace them back to who advocated and wanted those laws, then you have to see that white supremacy is central to both sides of the aisle. And the leading edge of white supremacy, not only back in the day in the 19th century or in the 1920s, but also today, is anti-immigrant legislation and anti-immigrant policy. So I have so much hatred for Bill Clinton. It's like I just never, it's like an endless well. Yeah, it's really, yeah.
No, I like, especially the 96 laws. It's horrifying, because that whole framing of criminal aliens that came out of the legislative debate is something that has sort of cast this long shadow. Can you I think we should actually talk about that too. You started with the Chinese exclusion laws, and how, do you see any parallels between the rhetoric that behind the sort of anti-Asian migration laws of the 19th century and the rhetoric of criminality and danger that we've been seeing so much for the past 20, 30 years?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely see the resonances, and I think it's also important to go back to our liberal immigration law of 1965, the Immigration and Naturalization Act, or also known as the Hart-Celler Act. So the 1965 Act is seen as being the opening up of our borders. It is seen as the Civil Rights Act of immigration, and in some ways that is true. For example, civil rights was a foreign policy decision in terms of why would the government actually stand for this, right? It's because it's not a good look in the Cold War when you're trying to woo decolonizing nations to come to your side and not go to the Soviet Union and the Second World. It's a bad look when you have Jim Crow, right? It's a bad look when you have openly racist immigration laws that exclude most Asians, right? So there's like a foreign policy kind of, it was a foreign policy decision. So in that sense, the 1965 Immigration Act is more open, especially for Asian people, but it also was more restrictive. So it was the first time that we restricted and capped the number of migrants and immigrants who could enter from the Western Hemisphere. So all of Latin America, that means all of Mexico. The numbers didn't actually change that much when we first, in terms of people crossing the border, coming here to work, going home, etc. The numbers didn't jump that much, but the numbers of illegal immigrants jumped a bunch because there was no cap before, right? And all of a sudden you're like, you can only have 20,000 people come in. Well, I mean, of course, then everyone else is going to be considered illegal and criminalized, right? And so it's really the 1965 Act that we see as the roots of criminalizing Mexican immigrants in particular, and other Latin American immigrants. But that's where we see the kind of identification of the ideal illegal immigrant shifting from an Asian body to a Latino body, right? A Latinx body. And so I think a lot of the rhetoric that comes from both the era of exclusion and the era of like post-1965, but especially post-1980 kind of migration fears, it's very similar. And a lot of them are based in California. California was the leading edge of the anti-Chinese movement. California is also the leading edge of a lot of anti-immigrant anti-immigrant rhetoric against Mexicans and Latin Americans, right? Where did the first border fences go up? In California. Who are some of the biggest advocates of these kinds of policies? California's Congress people, like that guy Duncan something, I forget I forget his name. Anyways, he's been calling for a wall for decades, So I think some of these kinds of histories, we can see resonances and parallels. And I think this is also why Asian American history, I think there is a kind of historical and also still living memory of these kinds of being targeted by these racist rhetorics that is useful for interpreting what is happening, not necessarily against us since we've been reformed as model minorities, but against other kinds of targeted people. And I think we have a responsibility to use that history, use our history for the purposes of liberation, right? And for the purposes of stopping the targeting of other kinds of people.
Thanks. So I want to be mindful of time and allow people in the audience to ask questions, but I just want to make sure that we're sort of bringing this up to date because, of course, SUDU was founded during the Trump administration at a time when Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon were really like combing through the legal frameworks that you've talked about and identifying how they could be weaponized in service of, the idea of creating a country that is whiter, that it caters to the sort of fears of being replaced by people of color that so many white racists have expressed. But then we now have a president, Biden, who campaigned on the promise of dismantling a lot of what the Trump administration built. What has happened, in fact, over the course of this administration so far?
Yeah, like not much that's good, yeah. I would say. I mean, look, okay, so just going back to like the Trump thing. Okay, so that didn't, I tried to cut and paste something into the chat, but I just want to point out, can you guys see that? It's looking all weird for me.
Yeah.
How about this? Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is a quote from Jeff Sessions to Steve Bannon on Breitbart in 2015. So before Trump even announced his candidacy for president, right? But this is what they want to bring us back to. So I mentioned the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924. 1924 is a really important year because we had the first globally comprehensive racial restriction on immigration. And then we also created the Border Patrol. So it's a significant year. And I also talked about how the Johnson-Reed Act was the legislative achievement of the eugenics movement because the way that it targeted people was designed to allow Northern and Western Europeans and exclude everyone else. Right. And so it was a racial engineering thing. Hitler actually really admired this policy and wrote about it in Mein Kampf. Right. But, when Jeff Sessions is talking nostalgically about these numbers in 1924, citing that year, and then also identifying 1965 as a problem, this is their agenda. They want to have a eugenicist nation, go back to a eugenicist nation, but without using the word eugenics. Right. So in terms of Biden, okay. So, yeah, I guess it's less explicitly and openly cruel. And I think that makes an actual difference in certain people's lives who did feel like openly targeted by the Trump administration. And I think that's not insignificant because when you're talking about a qualitative difference in many people's lives, then you have to take note of it. I think like abandoning the attacks on DACA, for example, is something that I would point to. I would say that like rescinding the Muslim ban and rescinding some of those other executive orders, those are not insignificant. And I think this is true for other kinds of policies as well, like environmental protections, protecting certain kinds of national monuments that are on we're all on indigenous land, but like, Bears Ears and things like this from oil exploitation. These are all important things. Right. And also, like we have Kamala Harris saying, don't come, which is, out of step with international law. And then also out of step with her campaign promises. Like she spoke very passionately about how this is not who we are. Like we tell them to go home. And now we're not even telling them to go home. We just fill up planes with their bodies and send them back. Right. And so, it is, beyond disappointing that he has not yet rescinded Title 42, which is the kind of legislation, or not legislation, but it's the policy that justifies what's going on at the southern border right now. We still have tons of people in camps, things like this. So for every small concession that he has done, I'm not saying that those are not meaningful, because again, they directly impact people's lives. But at the same time, things are not going to get better unless we rescind the actual policies and legislation. We undo the legislation. We reallocate budget lines. We have to shrink ICE's and CBP's, especially CBP's budgets, right? Until we do that, we're not going to have lasting change. And then there's no way that he's going to win the next election. So we have a very short, and it's like, now we have like we have 1 year left to get some of this stuff done. And my concern is that if he doesn't delegitimize some of these policies and laws right now, then they are only going to get worse when whoever takes his place comes in a couple of years, right? And so it's an urgent crisis right now. So when I was talking about like, we can't wait until the babies are like taken from their parents' arms, we need to be like on it right now, right? And so yeah, but you know, to be honest, like I don't think that I was never looking to Biden as being somebody that I could depend on, because I've looked at his legislative record. You know, he's not a friend to working people. He's not a friend to immigrants. He's not a friend to people who have been subjected to organized abandonment. So yeah, I don't know what to say other than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been especially distressing to see the continued growth in the number of people who are in immigration detention. And, you know, there's the recent news that I think exemplifies this on the one hand, on the other hand of this administration, where Moshan Valley, which was a private prison that had a Justice Department contract to hold people in federal prison custody, that contract was canceled because of the Biden administration's executive order phasing out the private prison contract under the Justice Department. But very soon after that contract got shut down, ICE moved in and signed a new contract with the same private prison company to just reopen the prison as an immigration detention center.
And you know, and this is also the reason why, like, it's not just about, I did mention like canceling those contracts or getting in front of those contracts, making sure they're not signed. But the problem is not just the contracts, it's the fact that these cages exist in the first place, or that they can be built so quickly. So what does it take to build a migrant detention camp? You need land, you need water, you need certain kinds of materials. Are there ways to like interrupt that? You know, like how to throw like sugar in the gas tank, I guess, you know. But I think like you know, private prison corporations are super important to migrant detention and immigrant detention in particular. That's their biggest growth area. And also, even if we are able to destroy GEO Group and these other private prison corporations, that doesn't solve the problem, because the state is ready to rush in and just start administering those same detention centers. They can't do it as efficiently and quickly, but they can still do it. And so once those camps are set up, even if GEO Group goes away, we still have ICE. And so ICE is really, you know, like the whole infrastructure is the problem, right?
So there's a question from Celeste in the chat. How can we make historical sense of the current situation around budget reconciliation and overruling the parliamentarians' recent ruling on immigration?
Mm-hmm. So they did not overrule the parliamentarians' judgment, right? When it came to citizenship for all. Yeah, of course. So yeah, wasn't she an ICE prosecutor? You would know this better than I would.
Yeah, before, I think it was in the INS days. So before ICE was ICE, but she was an immigration prosecutor.
Yes. So prosecutors are cops. They just wear suits instead of uniforms. You know, so like, it's not surprising to me that she would shoot down the citizenship provisions. I have so many different thoughts on the immigration things that are in the reconciliation bill. I think that, okay, so I have this constant shuttling between on the one hand, on the other hand, right? So on the one hand, of course, I support citizenship for all undocumented people. Of course, I feel like this is a foregone conclusion. And also, on the other hand, Baji, like Black Alliance for Just Immigration, has been quite critical of the citizenship for all framework as granting citizenship to certain kinds of immigrants while further criminalizing everyone else. And they know from history and from lived experience that those immigrants who are going to be targeted are Black immigrants, which is a fact, right? That is just true, right? So, you know, this is what I mean, like, what are we talking about freedom all? What do we mean by citizenship for all? Citizenship for all does not include people in the border camps. It does not include people remaining in Mexico. It will not include, I don't think it includes like the Afghanis who are trying to climb onto airports or climb into the airport, right? So it's not real, like they're not being literal in that use of all. They mean all people, all undocumented people who have been into the US for a certain amount of time, et cetera, right? So I am here for citizenship for all in the literal sense of the meaning of all, right? Is that a practical thing that could actually be passed as policy in the current under current conditions? I recognize that it is not, but it's still an aspiration and a goal. And anytime you're making a negotiation or concession in order to get part of the goal, but not all of the goal, you have to make sure that you're not leaving anyone behind. That's just a core principle of abolition, right, and liberation. And so you also have to think, and I think immigration history, especially in the last 40 years, is so instructive on this. But one of the key questions of a non-reformist reform is, are we going to be fighting the thing that we're fighting for right now? Are we going to be fighting against it in 5 to 10 years? And so if you look at, for example, the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, that act seemed really great because it gave a path to citizenship for 3 million about 3 million undocumented persons. And also it gave massive amounts of budget lines to CBP, or like it wasn't CBP, but to the INS enforcement, right? It also started a greater push for interior enforcement, not just border enforcement. So this is where we start seeing the precedents for raids, the legislative precedents for raids embedded in that law. So it is absolutely clear to say that on the one hand, yes, of course, I wanted those 3 million people to get documentation and a path to citizenship. And also that the benefits for those 3 million people led to the mass criminalization of millions and millions and millions more undocumented people or immigrants and migrants. So again, we are still fighting against that, you know, those concessions that we made in 1986. So, yeah.
Yeah. So there are 2 questions. One, Yoshino asks, sorry to go back so far into the beginning of the presentation, but I'm super curious about the painting you showed in the beginning. This is the slide, you know, yes, sort of about settler colonialism.
Yes. So when I teach about settler colonialism, I actually make my students like spend like 15 minutes just analyzing this image. So this is a very famous painting by John Gast. And it is, so there is an angel. This is like, so it's a painting of manifest destiny, right? That not only are we just better and more civilized than indigenous people, but we are destined by God, right, to take over this land. And so if you actually look at I know it was kind of small in the slide that I showed you, but if you see what's behind the angel as she's coming across, moving from east to west of the frame, is like a train, a railroad, industrialized, settled agriculture. What's in front of her, and also that part of the painting is light. It looks like it's illuminated. And as she moves to the right side or to the left side of the frame to the west, you see Indians on the run, right? You see buffalo on the run, and it's cast in shadow. And so it's a representation of the US's, or like of settlers' God-given destiny to eradicate indigenous people and civilizations and to replace it with its own civilization.
Thanks. And yeah, I'm so glad to have the framing about settler colonialism when we're talking about all of these policies of exclusion, removal, detention, because it's like that's the philosophical foundation on which all of this is built. And it's not about the, sort of this abstract notion of what it means to be a sovereign nation that often comes up in these discussions about open borders or about an end to detention. Janet asks, what's the current status of the concept of guest worker?
I don't know what you mean by the current status, but I would say, okay, so about guest workers. So braceros are guest workers, but which we ended in the 1960s, but we still have this really robust program called the H2 worker program, which is for seasonal workers. So forestry, agriculture, fishing, things like this. But also, we also have H1 workers who are more like high tech. It's more affiliated with like high tech visas. So, people who work in Silicon Valley or something like that, they need coders. So they have these visas help bring them over. Okay. So before 9/11, George W. Bush was actually talking more seriously about immigration reform, and one of the key reforms would be expanding the H2 worker program, which seems like a totally reasonable, rational solution to the problem of illegal immigration or undocumented immigration, right? Because you give people visas, people want to work, so that you give them a guaranteed job, and it comes with it's supposed to come with certain kinds of things like housing, transportation, medical care, and a savings account, right? But if you look on the ground, what's actually happening to migrants who have these visas, it's basically like indentured labor, right? Because they're not allowed to choose their employer. They're not allowed to leave their job. And then because of that, the companies, the employers who hire these H2 workers and H1B workers, they can set up wildly exploitative conditions. They're supposed to be paid by the hour, but in fact, they're paid by the piece or the pound, right? As a way of depressing their wages. They're supposed to have certain things provided like housing and food. Those are not, they're insufficient. And so the workers have to end up supplementing their food allocations, right? With their own wages. If they get injured, that's taken out of their pay. If they're not able to work because they're injured, it's also taken out of their pay. So when you actually see what's happening with these guest worker programs, it is wildly exploitative. And so if we're going to have some kind of guest worker program, there has to be robust regulation and enforcement of those regulations, which we never do, right? And so I understand the appeal of these kinds of piecemeal reforms. And also, I just don't see how we're going to get to a new place with immigration unless we think holistically. And also, we're not going to address issues of undocumented immigration or migration flows unless we deal with questions of US imperialism, both economically and in terms of our foreign policy. It's just not possible. And so if you look at the history of of more immigration flows coming from certain areas of the world, they're almost always tied to free trade policies or certain kinds of foreign policies like supporting dirty wars or things like that. So we're not going to be able to address this in a real way, in a robust way that actually makes solid changes to build on unless we think holistically about it. And that is going to require not thinking about it just about the United States and its territorial borders.
Yeah, I think so. Janet has a couple of follow-ups, but one thing that I think is important to keep in mind here is that just to step back from the much bigger sort of imperialism question, the presumption in U.S. immigration law is that you cannot come to the United States. If you can come, then you can't stay. If you can stay, then you can't become a citizen. And so it's like it's not like there's any sort of clear path to getting like a less contingent level of status in wherever you're able to like get somewhere. And then when you add into that the extremely long delays in the system to get any kind of status, that like that's why like all of this is something that is so incredibly broken if you're thinking of it not as a system of exclusion and denial, but as a system that is, supposed to facilitate, people reuniting with their families, building lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always, I mean, our immigration policy is always written from the perspective of the United States. It's never written from the perspective of migrants themselves. And then also like the kind of roadblocks that you're talking about at each stage as you go through, this is for working class people, right? What's her name? Melania Trump, right? She was an undocumented immigrant worker, but she was a model, and then she married a billionaire, and then she, was able to regularize her status. And then, Kushner and the daughter, Ivanka Trump, were like hosting large meetings with Chinese billionaires that if they bought certain kinds of property from the Kushner, whatever real estate empire, that they could facilitate getting citizenship papers. You know what I mean? It's the same in Europe too. Like if you buy a piece of property in Montenegro that's worth $1 million and you get EU citizenship or something like that. So this is not a US specific thing, but it is definitely a capitalist thing.
Yeah. And so one of Janet's questions is about the ECA experience. This is sort of the first generation of Japanese American immigrants sort of around the turn of the 20th century. And one thing that I want to highlight there is that not every Issei was somebody who immigrated through regularized channels. Mm-hmm. There's so many stories that we have in our families that, there's a story in my family of my great-grandfather being on a merchant marine ship and then just stepping off into Seattle when he was on shore leave. That was entering without inspection. That is one of the things that was criminalized in the 1924 law. And I think we don't, if you're not thinking of these stories in the frame of immigration law, you don't realize that these are stories about undocumented immigration.
Yeah. And I think that this is why, like, I really just I kind of want to destabilize all the categories and just be like, they're all kind of illegitimate because they're all from the perspective of the state and never from this perspective of migrants. So I've like, for example, I've stopped using the word refugee just in my own writing because the category of the refugee was always taken from the state's point of view, what is good for the state, and not as like, oh my God, we've created millions of refugees from our war-making practices or whatever, right? It's not about them. It's really about what is good for us. And it's always been a category, like you said, about excluding people, right? It used to be, there were times when the refugee category was taken as a blanket designation to bring lots of people at the same time. But now it is used as a blanket designation almost to keep people out, right? You have to prove yourself over and over. Are you a legitimate bona fide refugee, right? And so I think like, just refusing the legitimacy of some of these categories of documented, undocumented, legal, illegal, bona fide asylum seeker or refugee versus economic migrant, like none of these are legitimate. Because if you actually look at the experiences of the people who need to migrate, almost always, if they could choose to stay home and have a good life, and raise their families and have what they need, a lot of them would choose to do that. Right. But, so it's like, it's just never, I just don't, the more I think about these kinds of issues, like the more that I think that the categories that we end up reproducing in our best efforts end up kind of shoring up things that we need to be actually taking apart.
Thanks. And I think we have time for one more question. Celeste asks, could we clarify again the state's strategy in pitting certain immigrant categories against each other, like in the example with Trump versus Hawaii and Korematsu decision concurrently? Are they policy versions of the model minority setup?
I feel like the state is always setting us against each other, like always, because that's how they maintain their power. Because, if you take all working class people, right, or all people who are basically not in that kind of the very top echelons of power and economically and politically, like we outnumber them, and like we have an enormous power base, right? If you combine all, this is a Ruthie Gilmore quote, but if you combine all the people who are documented not to work, i.e. all the people who have been affected by the prison system and have to check have you ever been in jail or arrested or whatever, and therefore ineligible for employment, that's 65 million people. And then you have all the people who are not documented to work, i.e. undocumented immigrants, who are subject to deportation and detention. If you combine those two groups of people, you have a massive power base of working class people. It's more than half the US workforce, right? But because criminalized citizens or targeted citizens are pit against immigrants of color, working class immigrants, because they take our jobs and blah, blah, blah. And then immigrants also play into this because they're like, well, we're law abiding. These are false narratives that end up tearing us apart from each other when we actually share material conditions that could lead to a real power base. And so the state has always been doing this against us. And I do think that the model minority setup is part of that. And I think as I think most of the people on this call are Asian, but like I really call for us to be race traders to the model minority ethos, that you can work hard and like do good things and not embrace those kind of ideologies, right? And you can use like your position as someone who is racialized as a model minority, but being openly against it in order to basically tear it apart from inside out and be like, I'm not going to be used by white supremacists in order to put down everyone else. And I think this is why the settler colonial framework I'm finding more and more useful, because settler colonialism targets everyone, non-white people, immigrant people, disabled people, women, genderqueers, everyone, right? It shows us how we are all targeted by similar systems and that we all have more to gain by not being ableist. Even though I'm an able-bodied person, this is something that I'm trying to learn more about, right? And trying to reproduce in my own practices. But it's like, I think the more that we can like see through the ways that we're torn apart from each other and instead see the shared foundations of the shit that we're dealing with, the better off we're all going to be.
Awesome. I think that's a great closing note for this segment. I'm going to thank you so much, Professor Paik. I'm going to hand it over to Yoshino for the Jamboard activity.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Paik and Carl, for the amazing conversation. And right now, I'd like to kind of do a little Jamboard activity. So this is where we kind of like write our thoughts, and I'll paste the link here. So you can go to this link, and then it's where we can kind of write our thoughts, talk about like what brought you here. I wrote a little instruction on how to use this Jamboard, and I can also share my screen. Oh wait, could you enable screen sharing privileges, Catherine, or one of the hosts? But yeah, okay, you can go here. Oh yeah, thank you. And then you can go here to kind of post a sticky note. Okay. Yeah, so right here, and then you can copy and paste this sticky note, and then you can click on it to like write your note and then save it. And then another note, there's a couple other questions on the second and third slides, so you can click the little arrow at the top. And then we'll do this for about 10 minutes, and then I'll pass it on to Catherine after this. But yeah, feel free to write anything. Oh wait, sorry guys. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen a little bit so Casey can play some nice music for us. Thanks, Casey.
Can folks hear me? Sorry. I just wanted
Yes.
to say, please continue adding to the Jamboard, but I just wanted to put in a few direct calls to action if you're feeling, super outraged, inspired by the information that Professor Paik and Carl have shared with us. So the first is sort of a national policy ask, and that is to call on the Biden administration to end Title 42, which is the public health law that's currently being used as justification to expel and deport migrants from the border without giving people a chance to seek asylum first, when we know that asylum is both a legal right and a moral obligation in this country that's built on stolen land. So this is a direct policy request to the Biden administration and would have an immediate impact, as it's currently being used to deport migrants, particularly Haitian migrants, at this present moment. So I've pasted in the chat the Google Doc, and that will take you to a link with several action items. The first being a petition that a partner of ours, Rice, has put out, calling on the administration to end Title 42. And I have a couple more calls to action that are California specific. Suitor for Solidarity participates in the ICE Out of California Coalition, which is just a coalition of racial and immigrant justice groups working towards immigrant liberation and abolition of ICE and detention in California. So we're working right now to pass the Vision Act through the California state legislature, because right now people are serving their time in prison or California's jails and prisons, and when their sentences are up, they're being stolen by ICE instead of being able to go home with their families and to rejoin families and communities. They're being stolen by ICE and further detained. So the Vision Act would make that process illegal. So where it's at right now is it's going to be reintroduced in the 2022 session of the California legislature. So we're trying to drum up votes in the California State Senate. So if you live in California, if you have any relationship with unions, California Democratic clubs, California city councils, or you're just interested in advocacy on this issue, I would encourage you to follow the ICE Out of California Coalition on Twitter. And you can also just reach out to Suitor to get plugged in. And then I have a couple calls to action from it's the hashtag Home Not Heartbreak campaign. So they're doing that in November and December, heading into the holidays. Every week they are putting out a call to action for folks to make social media posts and call elected officials, urging for certain specific community members to be freed, because these are people who have, again, completed their sentences and are just being transferred directly to ICE detention instead of getting to go home and rejoin their families and communities for the holidays. So you will find a toolkit in that doc with just templates for social media posts that you can make to call on relevant elected. Yeah, so that is the Home Not Heartbreak campaign. And then the hashtag Free Enrique toolkit, that is one specific community member. His name is Enrique Meneses, and he's an immigrant and a father who had been incarcerated until the Governor Newsom actually publicly commuted his sentence. But instead of being released, ICE went and arrested him, and he's been in detention ever since, away from his family, away from his community. And he is really, he's really a really obviously important figure for his family and his community. And it would be really great if he could gain his freedom in time for the holidays. So there you'll also find a toolkit when our partners are working to free him as well. So from the national to the to the local, to the California specific, you will find some calls to action in there. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Celeste to talk about our discussion of Professor Paik's book.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks everybody for hanging in there with us. Yeah, and just to kind of reiterate, if we could all, just take a second to open this doc and like click open some of the links. You don't have to do it now, but like, in order to build our own practices of accountability to make sure we're actually signing these things and getting into them, we wanted to give a second so that we can all make sure that we have this. And we'll send out a follow-up email too. But with that, we also wanted to give a plug for our next event, which is going to be December 9th at 5 p.m. Pacific time, 8 p.m. Eastern time. And it's going to be a book club to discuss Dr. Paik's book, which we got, I think, a really good primer for today. So please register via that link if you haven't already. And then we also wanted to give an opportunity to invite you all to join our next Joint Policy Advocacy Committee and Education Committee meeting, which is we're the committee who co-sponsored this event. And that's going to be December 1st, which is a Wednesday at 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. Eastern time. And we'd love to have you there and continue to build. This is our first joint event and like teach-in type thing. So we're really excited to do learning in community and understand how this is a critical part of our solidarity work. And I think we're going to end the night there. Thank you so much again, Dr. Paik and Carl and everybody who joined. I think we all feel really motivated after this really, really important time together. So we'll see you all December 9th.
Thank you all so much for tonight. I really appreciate being part of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Perhaps before whoever wants to stay, can we take a picture? A nice little Zoom picture? Okay, I can go ahead and do it if everyone's comfortable with that. Just for the memes, or we can post it on social media too. Okay, so on the count of 3, say cheese. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, well, I'm gonna do it one more time. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Yay, thanks everyone.
Casey got her hair out. I love it.
Yeah, I like that. Okay.
Bye.
If I have time, I might drop into your reading group. I think it would be fun. So.
Oh gosh, guest appearance.
Yeah.